of metaphors. It has to do with what I'm trying to finish off now. And I mean, I should have finished it like a month ago. I have a draft, but I'm not happy with it. And I keep hovering over a particular chapter. And I think what you said yesterday may give me an angle into what I want to say about metaphor. Because the word, the word that you mentioned yesterday, analogia and eikon, especially eikon, keeps appearing in the symposium.
Yes. It has a very particular meaning for Proclus, which he's usually fairly fussy about. On occasion, less so, but yeah, generally he's quite particular in his uses of that. Hello.
Yes, Yorgo. I'm trying to figure out whether there is something that in the historical development of how comfortable Plato's commentators felt with his use of metaphor, I think is what I'm trying to say. And whether they were trying ways to defend his use of metaphor. And that's why Proclus is so fussy, because to me, that's a relatively new area.
Yes, I mean, he certainly is concerned with defending Plato's use of metaphor there. I think it might be interesting to perhaps to look at the sorts of things he has to say about Homer as well. His defenses of Homeric poetry that are sometimes allegorical, as famously sometimes allegorical, but not always. And the understanding of the different types of poetry perhaps might be, maybe grist to the mill, I'm not sure.
I need to keep thinking. George, did you see my message in the chat?
Yes, of course.
So I hope we won't have any issue, but it may crop up because they've already told me that their connection is bad.
Let's hope for the best.
Let me check. Cool. 1 minute to go. I'm logging off from here because I need to communicate something to the other George on the other computer. See you soon.
Okay.
Bye. Bye.
So, hello. I would like to welcome you all to the second day of the conference, The Reception of Plato from Late Antiquity to the Middle Ages. This is the parallel session 2, and I would like to invite Rares Marinescu from the University of Cambridge to deliver his speech, Nature as an Instrumental Cause, Proclus Prologue in his commentary on the Timaeus.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction. So I'd like to share my handout. I have a very small handout. I hope I can do that. Yeah, can you see my handout now? Does it work?
Yes, it's visible.
Okay, that's great. Yeah. Okay, so first of all, this is really a summary of a paper, so apologies in advance for the brevity of the argument, and in case some things are missing or not entirely clear, we can discuss them after the paper. So really what I'd like to do in this paper is to focus on the concept of the instrumental cause in the prologue of Proclus's commentary on the Timaeus. So unlike earlier Neoplatonists who do not make much use of this type of causality, Proclus relates the instrumental cause to the hypostasis of nature, to physis. The main idea is that the demiurge uses nature as an instrument in his ordering and creation of the cosmos. So that is T1, that would be an evidence of this use of instrument for nature. Identifying nature with this form of causality is supposed to account for nature's causal efficacy as an intermediary entity between the intelligible and the sensible realm. So how does Proclus get to this understanding of nature? Why does he associate nature with this otherwise obscure form of causality? And I'd like to argue that this description of nature as an instrumental cause is in part based on Proclus's critical reception of Aristotle, who, as is well known, identifies nature with the formal, efficient, and or final cause. So he associates nature either separately with one of these three, or even he even says that these three can coincide in Physics 2:7. That is, Proclus does not develop his views on the causality of nature only by looking at the Timaeus and other Platonic or Platonist sources, but also by engaging with Aristotle's rich reflections on this issue. This also explains the centrality of Proclus's criticism of Aristotle in the prologue of the Timaeus commentary, where one of the main concerns of Proclus is defining nature. This importance of nature is due to Proclus's identification of the skopos of the Timaeus as concerning the whole of physical inquiry. So physiologia is the term there, and then obviously this necessitates an answer to what physis is. So before we turn to Proclus' engagement with Aristotle, I think it is worth bearing in mind and recalling Proclus' classification of causes, and that is T2 on the handout. So Proclus essentially makes a twofold distinction between true causes, proper causes, and auxiliary causes, on the other hand. So the true causes are 1 to 3, so that would be the final cause, the paradigmatic cause, and the demiurgic cause, which is most of the time called the efficient, the productive cause, to poietikon aition. And then there are 3 types of auxiliary causes, synaitia. These are the instrumental cause, the formal cause, and the material cause. And it's also worth mentioning that this 6-fold scheme is not a Proclean innovation, but is already attested for Porphyry. And the 5-fold scheme, excluding the instrumental cause, is, as is well known, is found in Seneca's letter 65. So I'm not going to discuss the background of this classification, but I think it's important to point out that as an instrumental cause, nature is an auxiliary cause, according to this scheme, and not a true proper cause. So moving on, when Proclus attacks Aristotle, he generally claims that Aristotle has wrongly focused on the auxiliary causes in his natural philosophy, and more specifically, that he associated nature with the wrong type of cause. So, as Proclus makes clear in his prologue, nature can be neither an efficient cause, nor a final cause, nor a formal cause. And for the first point, so why nature can't be really an efficient cause, T3, I think, is quite indicative. So I'm only going to read half of this passage. So those who have led the faction after Plato, not all of them, but at least the more exacting, believe that the physicist should study the form too, alongside matter, tracing back the origins of body to matter and form. And now comes the important bit. So, for although they may perhaps make mention of the productive cause as well, as when they affirm that nature is the origin of motion, they still deprive it of any vigorous or strictly productive role. since they do not agree that this cause embraces the reason principles of those things that are created through it, but allow that many things come about spontaneously too. So Proclus' main objection here is that Plato's successors, and I think the expression clearly, as most people do, clearly includes Aristotle, as this idea of nature being a principle of motion indicates, failed to correctly develop the notion of an efficient cause. For Aristotle, the efficient cause of physical things is a principle of movement and is identified with nature. And that's what Proclus says here in 220. So nature is the origin of motion. As origin of movement, according to Proclus, it lacks a vigorous and strictly productive role, to drasterion kai to kurios poetikon, and cannot be considered an efficient cause in Proclus' sense. This is because it fails to embrace, as he says, the reason principles of those things that are created through it. Okay, so what does Proclus mean by it? So it seems that the idea is that, according to Proclus, nature needs to contain the logoi, the reason principles, of the physical things it produces, and these logoi ultimately originate in the transcendent forms. So these reason principles are found in the hypostasis of nature and are transmitted through it to the bodies in order to provide them with a structure and unity. And even in this case, so even if nature, or according to Proclus, nature does have these logoi, even in that case, nature is only a proximate efficient cause. That is, it is an instrument to the gods insofar as the ultimate efficient cause is the demiurge who uses nature in this creative process. So in this way, nature is only an auxiliary cause and is connected to the proper causes, i.e. the paradigmatic cause and the demiurge. And at any rate, nature is not an efficient cause in the way Aristotle conceived it. In a second step, Proclus is also pointing out that there is something wrong about the way Aristotle envisions final causality. And that is T4 on the handout. And this is an abbreviated, the passage is abbreviated here. It's actually much longer. So it seems to me that the incredible Aristotle was also imitating Plato's teaching to the best of his ability when he arranged his whole treatment of physics like this. As for what concerns coming to be, part belongs to the things in the skies, whose principles Plato has accounted for, while Aristotle has extended their teaching beyond what was called for. But another part extends to the study of animals, so that's zoology, something which Plato has given a detailed explanation of with regard to all their causes, including the final cause and the auxiliary causes. While in Aristotle's work, they have only, with difficulty and in a few cases, mogis kaien oligois, been studied in relation to form. And the conclusion is, for in most cases, Aristotle stops at the point of matter, and by pinning his explanations of physical things on this, so on matter, he demonstrates to us just how far he falls short of the teaching of his master. So in this well-known passage, Proclus characterizes Aristotle as an emulator of Plato. He imitates Plato, showing why Aristotle falls behind his master, at least in natural philosophy. And at the end of this passage, we encounter the claim that Aristotle studied the causes, including the final one, only with difficulty in animals. This is puzzling for most readers, as Aristotle often refers to the final cause in his biological works and generally in his physical works. And I take it that Proclus objects here to Aristotle's concept of natural teleology. Nature cannot be, properly speaking, a final cause, since it does not belong to the true causes and occupies only this intermediary position between the intelligible and the sensible realm. Instead, a correct Platonic explanation of the universe, and therefore also of the animals contained in the universe, must recognize the one or good as the ultimate final cause, right? Because this is the true final cause, according to Proclus. So something like nature, the nature of a thing could not account for the thing's final cause, at least not in a strong sense. And this ultimate final cause, the one good, and I quote here Proclus, which one should be especially desirous of discovering in the case of the universal creation. And that's in fact one of the things that Proclus does in his commentary, to point towards the one and the good when commenting on the Timaeus. So obviously, since Aristotle rejects the good as the highest principle, his teleology and therefore natural philosophy is highly deficient, according to Proclus, and compromised. And I'd like to argue that this critique gives us good reason for why, according to Proclus, nature should not be regarded as a final cause. And just very briefly, a last point. So in his digression on nature at the end of the prologue, so that's 9:30 to around 12:30, Proclus recounts Aristotle's association of nature with enmattered form, and that's T5 of the handout. So this is part of a doxography where Proclus recounts earlier views on nature, and he says, this is because some of the ancients used the term nature for matter, like Antiphon, and some for form, as Aristotle did in many places. So that's presumably physics too. And then he also lists other possible associations of nature or identifications of nature. But as for Plato, he does not believe that the term nature should refer primarily to matter, nor the form in matter. So that's a reference to the Aristotelian enmattered forms, or the body, and so on. Rather, he taught us the most accurate approach to it by locating its essence, so nature's essence, in between the two, that is, in between soul and body. So Aristotle here rejects, Proclus here rejects Aristotle's identification of nature with forms, primarily on the basis of his Timaeus exegesis. He quotes Plato there, since Plato presumably identifies nature with this essence between soul and body. But also, one could find other reasons for why nature is not a formal cause. For instance, based on T3, this idea that nature somehow needs to be a proximate, efficient cause, right? So it cannot be a formal cause in that sense. So briefly, in conclusion, I've tried to argue that an analysis of Proclus's critique of Aristotle in the prologue helps us significantly in understanding Proclus's association of nature with the instrumental cause and his rejection of other types of causality. Proclus' introduction of instrumental causality in this context is thus not simply a case of an unnecessary proliferation of explanatory principles, as some critics might say, but rather is supposed to do justice to nature's intermediate role in the universe's creation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Raris. Are there any comments or remarks or questions for the speaker? If you want to ask something, just raise your hand virtually or pose a question via the chat. Yes, Professor Balzi. Yes,
thank you very much. Thank you very much for the paper. That was interesting and delivered nicely in a short amount of time. Can I ask you a question which is a bit off topic, but I suppose it's a matter of whether you think Proclus is playing fair here. I mean, it seems conspicuous that he talks about Aristotle's notion of nature only as an internal cause of motion, not of motion and rest. And one might well wonder what it is that the putative logoi contribute to structuring things and providing them with a kind of stability beyond what an internal cause of both change and stability or motion and rest would do?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. So I think first of all, whether Proclus is here, how should I say, a very whether this is a very productive criticism or rather polemical, I think in part it is meant to be quite polemical. So I don't know if he does truly justice. I think not. I don't think he truly does justice to Aristotle's concept of nature. And regarding your second question, I think what is very important for Proclus to point out is that even if nature is supposed to be an efficient cause, it has to be properly speaking productive, right? It needs to be poietikon. It's not enough for something to just set something else in motion, or as you point out, to cause it to rest. This wouldn't be enough, right? It needs to be part of this whole derivative metaphysical scheme. And I think it would be hard for someone to defend Aristotle so as to make him fit into that scheme. But that's obviously because Aristotle has other philosophical commitments. I don't know if this helped. But...
Okay. Are there any questions? Other questions for Ares? May I ask you something? Do we have any idea about the doxographical sources he used here?
Yeah,
because you mentioned that he was doing something like doxography, and I would like to know if we know his sources specifically.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question because actually that's part of the game Proclus plays. So his main doxographical source seems to be Aristotle, actually. So he takes Aristotle's doxography and seems to turn it against Aristotle. So Aristotle in his doxography, for instance, in Metaphysics Alpha, he talks about previous natural philosophers, criticizes them for only focusing on matter or only focusing on this aspect. And Proclus takes that over and then starts to criticize Aristotle himself by using Aristotle's doxography. So that's part of the game that Proclus is playing here. And this reference to an antiphon, for instance, that's clearly taken from the Metaphysics. It's not something that was really up to debate during Proclus's period. It's just taken from the Metaphysics.
Yes. Thank you for the answer. It was very enlightening. Are there any? We have time for another short question, if there is any. Okay. Thank you, Ares.
Thank you very much.
And the second speaker is Benedetto Neola from Istituto Italiano per gli Studi Filosofici at Naples. And the title of his paper is The One and the Intellect of Human Soul, Neoplatonic Receptions of Plato's Phaedrus.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, of course.
May I share the screen, Professor?
Yes, of course.
Okay. So, second. Can you see?
Benedetto, yes, it's visible.
Right. Okay. Great. Let's start. Plotinus notoriously holds that our soul never fails in the sensible realm in its entirety, but that something of it always remains in the intelligible, contemplating the hypostatic intellect. We as human beings are not usually aware of this psychic part, as the sensible dimension does not allow us to perceive the objects that the highest part of our soul always contemplates. Plotinus' innovative doctrine, known by the name of the undescended soul theory, was not welcomed by later Neoplatonists, and Plotinus himself seemed to be aware of it. Indeed, in his commentary on Timaeus, Iamblichus reprimands Plotinus for his conception that the human soul owns a part, the intellect, always contemplating the intelligible. According to Iamblichus, the figures impart that the charioteer of soul, Eniokos, that is, the highest part of soul, sometimes raises his head over the sky, sometimes falls down. In brief, the highest part in us is not always contemplating, contrary to what Plotinus held. Let us then start by reading the pivotal passage from Socrates' Palinode and then Iamblichus' use of it. As for the other souls, one that follows a god most closely, making itself most like that god, raises the head of his charioteer up to the place outside. Another soul rises at some time and falls at another. And what is the charioteer of the soul? Is it not the most attractive and one might say consummate part of us? And how can we avoid this conclusion, if indeed this is what directs our whole being and with its own head views the supercelestial sphere and is assimilated to the greater leader of the gods, who drives a winged chariot and journeys through the heaven as a first charioteer? And if the charioteer is the highest element in us, and he, as is said in the figures, sometimes is carried up aloft and raises his head into the region outside, while at other times he descends and fills his pair with lameness and molting, it plainly follows that the highest element in us experiences different states at different times. It would seem that Iamblichus' criticism starts as a reaction against the ethical corollary of a Plotinus doctrine, to become a metaphysical and epistemological criticism. The empirical observation of the human misery stands as the starting point for an overarching criticism against Plotinus' psychology and ontological system. Indeed, the Plotinian Theautes en tono eto aei would correspond to a hypothetic intellect always contemplating as morion of the human soul. In other words, that which is problematic in the eyes of Iamblichus and of later Neoplatonists is the interiorization of the hypostatic intellectual principle within the human soul. The entity always contemplating, conceptualized by Plotinus, does exist, but it's not interior to the human soul. As a consequence, if the definition of intellect is something which aei noei kai aei prostosteios in estin, then this intellect has nothing to do with the human soul. As a matter of fact, Iamblichus' view is attested also in the commentary on the figures by the Neoplatonist Hermes of Alexandria. Nonetheless, thanks to Hermes, we can legitimately maintain that Iamblichus' avowal of a human intellectual weakness, inferred from figures 2048, is only one side of the coin in Iamblichus' psychology. Indeed, Hermes plainly ascribes to Iamblichus a distinction between the charioteer, the Eniokos, and the steersman of human soul. What is in this place is without color and without shape and without solidity, a being that really is what it is, the subject of all true knowledge, visible only to intelligence, the soul steersman. There is a textual problem concerning the phrase psyches kybernete mono theateno. Judging by the English translation, the form no seems like a gloss which clarifies what the mythical Kybernetes is, a savoir, the intellect of the soul. Well, Iamblichus and Hermes did not read that no, and thus, faced with the phrase psyches kybernete mono theate, they were compelled to specify what the Kybernetes was. It goes without saying that Plato meant by Kybernetes and Eniokos, steersman and charioteer, the same thing, namely the intellect of the soul. In other words, Kybernetes and Eniokos are a variatio, a endiades. Instead, Iamblichus and Hermes exploit this endiades and draw a distinction between Eniokos and Kybernetes. Let us read Hermes' Commentary. The divine Iamblichus understands the steersman as the one of the soul, while the charioteer as its intellect. Socrates says visible only to, not in the sense that the one of the soul grasps the intelligible in question here as if it was a different object from it, but in the sense that it is united with it and thus benefits from it. Indeed, this passage clarifies that the steersman is something more perfect than the charioteer and the horses, as the one of the soul is united by nature with the gods. In rejecting Plotinus' doctrine of the so-called undescended soul, Iamblichus conceives of a new part of the soul capable of realizing the enosis tois theois. But how could he attribute to Plato something like the one of the soul which is patently absent from the dialogue? The answer is exegesis. Thanks to Hermes, we can thus really appreciate the exegetical refinement of Iamblichus, who does not miss the fact that in the figures Socrates mentions both a steersman and a charioteer. Thus the charioteer becomes the image of the individual intellect, while the steersman is the image of the psychic one. This latter, then, is the most perfect part of the soul insofar as it is naturally united with the divine. What is really striking in this context, though, is that Plotinus himself drew on the same passage from the figures, namely 2047, to formulate his own doctrine of the undescended soul that Iamblichus later criticized. That the soul is of the family of the divine nature, the eternal, is clear from our demonstration that it is not material. Besides, it has neither shape or color, nor is it tangible. Plotinus attributes the apophatic qualities of the real being described in the figures achromatos te schematis toscanaphes to the human soul, or to be more precise, to the divine part of the human soul, namely the theautes and tonoeto aei. Now, Plotinus' move depends on a text of the figures which is different from the one that we read nowadays. We commonly read the phrase ousia ontos ousa psyches cybernete, and translate a being that really is what it is, visible only to the soul steersman. Instead, Plotinus read ousia ontos ousa psyches cybernete, and thus understand the real being of the soul, visible only to. We can conclude that Iamblichus' criticism is the criticism of an exegete and commentator of the figures. Iamblichus is the first Neoplatonist who wrote a commentary on the figures, and he is the one who had posed the figures at the end of the first cycle of Platonic readings qua theological dialogue. Iamblichus then rejects Plotinus' reading of figures 2047, and by adding, so to speak, a salient comma between ousia and psyches, establishes the text that we read nowadays. Nonetheless, Iamblichus reveals himself to be an innovator. Indeed, Syrianus, Hermes' master, and Proclus, Hermes' co-disciple, keep the dative no in figures 2047, and interpret the Kybernetes as the intellect of the soul. Instead, Hermes follows the exegesis of Iamblichus and draws an explicit distinction between Kybernetes and the Neokos. In order to Platonize a new doctrine of the soul, Iamblichus and Hermes opt for a text which authorizes them to interpret the Kybernetes as they wished. In other words, the apposition no hindered their exegetical and philosophical purposes. In conclusion, after this necessarily brief presentation, it cannot but strike us at least the fact that this exegetical technique, consisting in isolating two members of an endiadys, Kybernetes and the Neokos, has tremendous repercussions on the doctrine of the soul and even on the doctrine of the intelligible. Also, and finally, this case of exegetical battle on the figures incites us to reflect on the relationship between Plotinus' doctrine of the undescended soul and Iamblichus' doctrine of the one of the soul. In other words, the question that I would like to address to you all is the following. Is it conceivable not to think to an opposition, but rather to a sort of a continuity between Plotinus' theautes and tono eto aei and Iamblichus' to hen tes psyches, two psychic parts, both derived from the exegesis of the figures? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Benedetto. Are there any questions or remarks for Benedetto? David, please.
Thank you. This was a very, very interesting talk. I just have a little question. I'm not sure what I understand well the possible opposition between the two, but I'm not sure what continuity would amount to. Can you say a little more about that?
Yes. If Iamblichus reprimands this doctrine, the undescended soul theory, it would seem that he removes a sort of connection between the soul and the intelligible. But while doing so, he at the same time conceives of a part of the soul which could guarantee the henosis, which was the originally aim of a Plotinus doctrine. In this sense, I think we could talk also of a continuity and not only of an opposition.
Other question? Maria, please.
Yes, thank you very much for your very interesting paper, touching upon an issue which is really crucial about the continuation of Neoplatonism. Now, what I would like to ask you is whether you have also looked into this matter among the Alexandrian Neoplatonists. Have you done that? This is just a question, okay? Have you looked into such a debate? Have you looked about such a debate among Ammonius of Hermes, Simplicius, John Philoponus, or anything? Have you done that, or is it something that you would like to do later? Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. I'm sorry, but actually I did not do this research. Also because I consider Hermes as a member of the Alexandrian school. So I did not search for other confirmation. Also because the theory of the one of the soul is widespread in the Neoplatonists in general. Also Proclus talk about it. For example, the anthos tes psyches, the flower of the soul, is the one of the soul. So I did not search for other evidence from later Alexandrian members.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Other question? Benedetto, do you have any idea about previous views on the same subject, like from people from Middle Platonists, for example?
I do think that the theory of the one of the soul is a Iamblichian theory. So no, I think it's an entirely new component, so to speak, of the soul. And at the same time, also the Theautes and Tonotoae of Plotinus is an innovative doctrine. So I do think that this debate is entirely belongs to the later Neoplatonism from Plotinus onwards.
So you support that they both broke with previous tradition?
Yes, yes. Also because I do think that Plato's texts do not authorize such a move, because the apex of the soul is the nous, while Plotinus, and in particular Iamblichus and Proclus, creates a new part of the soul, which can be viewed as the highest part of the intellect or as an entirely distinct part of the soul. So yes, I think there is a clear separation between later Neoplatonists and the so-called Middle Platonists.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor.
Other question for Benedetto? Okay, Benedetto, thank you once again for your very technical paper.
Thank you.
And I would like to call my colleague at the University of Athens, Anna Lazou. The title of her paper is The Neoplatonic Version of the Dance of the Stars Metaphor of the Platonic Time Age. Anna, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for the invitation and congratulations for the conference. I enjoy the conference. I'm not an expert in Neoplatonism, but I take this step as an opportunity to develop my arguments about the dance research in late antiquity. So thank you for the help, for the technical help as well. So please, I welcome your comments and remarks. So the Platonic image metaphor of the dancing world is linked to the traditional connection of dance and culture, existed long before the emergence of professional philosophers and scholars of ancient Greek literature and philosophy. The picture runs through the Hellenistic, Greco-Roman, and later phase of the Academy's millennium. Then, as in the heyday of classical Athens, the real world, created by a demiurge's mastermind, was perceived by educated audiences both as a powerful archetype for Greek group dances and as a divine source of the cultural superiority of the Hellenic culture. A series of references to this cosmological metaphor can be found in the source study of James Miller in 1986 and in authors representative of classical literature and philosophy and late antiquity and onwards that I mentioned in the handout. In the first 3 slides, I have tried to present types of depiction of the universe, models of the universe, as a consequence of the Platonic metaphor and its later elaboration. And it's only 3 of them, but there are a lot, particularly from Renaissance on. We have an attempt, various attempts of depicting the spherical and circular, mainly, Weltanschauung or cosmic geography of the universe. And I can say that I distinguish 2 possible models of depiction of the universe: a moving or mobile, let's say, a model that is, you can see on the left side of my slide, and that was I owe this depiction to Professor Moussas as the spiral and moving movements of the planet Zeus. And on the right side of my slide, you can see a late Renaissance crystallized model of the sphere with the Earth in the center. In the next slide, you can see a later developed crystallized spheric depiction inspired by Descartes' astronomical theories. At the same time, you can see the Earth at the center, but there are more multiple depictions of more, let's say, bodies in the celestial firmament. And in the next slide, my slide 3, it's a depiction in which I try to represent my approach, my understanding of the Timaeus metaphor in the Neoplatonic also evaluation, with the 3 graces in the center, 3 beautiful human bodies surrounded by a circular movement. In my next slide, slide number 4, we may speak a little bit about this metaphor of the Timaeus, where Plato narrates the creation of the world by referring to the architecture of the universe as a group dance, no longer as an acoustic harmony, but as a harmony of movements. It is a theatrical depiction of the world, stirring dance, without background music, a metaphor that suggests a celestial firmament full of living bodies moving due to an inner impulse of a psychological character, perhaps, impulse to imitate the example, paradigma, of the divine order imposed by the Creator on the world. This dance of the celestial bodies is accessible to the imagination of the terrestrial observer as a beautiful spectacle felt by anyone who can look with the naked eye at the bright night sky. This dance of the celestial bodies is accessible to the imagination of the terrestrial observer as a beautiful spectacle, but also has a cosmological reflection of the physical movement that occurs in the Platonic Timaeus, associated with the metrical practices of time, language, and philosophical criticism, while being placed both in the history of the ideas and in contemporary examples of philosophical and scientific examinations. Actually, the discussion about time starts before in 38b in Timaeus, where Timaeus refers to the astronomical problems of the construction of a calendar. And if we have time to remember to these extracts by Timaeus, we can draw interesting conclusions about cultural influences of the Hellenic mentality and connections with other cultures like Eastern cultures. But we can also say that in these descriptions of Timaeus, we have a great detail and technicality in description of what is going on in the universe. But later, only the idea of harmony remains as a main concept. In the next slide, slide 5, I would like to say a few things about the very idea of metaphor, translatio in Latin, as a familiar tool of Platonic writing and intellect, but also as a constant point of reference for linguistic, philosophical, and chorological analysis, and focus on the cognitive and methodological evaluation of the dance of the stars metaphor, both in the context of Platonic works and recent theories. Actually, dance remains today in the context of various authors as a metaphor of the intellectual procedures. Let's remember of Paul Valéry speaking about dance, about metaphor as the dance of the intellect. The metaphor with the meaning of similarity, analogy, or relation of representation and depiction is stated in Plato's vocabulary with the term ikon and related to the meaning of the paradigma, another term of similar use, similar but also different, and eidolon. In our search for different approaches in the Neoplatonic context, we can find mutations together with survivals and alterations of etymological, historical, philosophical, and semantic character of these terms. in my next slide, slide number 6, with emphasis on Plotinus and Proclus' work and on the work assumption that the aim was to find evidence for the organismic harmonious unity and collaboration of the human with the natural world, with their varied social, ethical, and political connotations, we collected, together with my colleague Steiris Bekakos, in our recent publication in the Philosophy Journal of Philosophical School, some texts, a selective series of text is the ones you can see on the slide. According to Pythagoras, Archytas, and Plato, the musical modes and sounds correspond to the movements of the known planets and stars. According to the Orphic hymns, a celestial law sets the stars in motion. According to Artemidorus, there is a mystic or secret meaning of the or impulse of the stars.
Unfortunately, we lost Anna. I hope she will be able to continue her presentation. Anna, do you hear us? Let's try. I will try to contact her through chat. Just a second. Give me a second. There's a power shortage in Anna's region, so she will connect through her cell phone, and she will be able to continue in just a second, just 1 minute. So please be patient. I think that the gods of the universe do not agree of their secrets be revealed, so they reacted.
I hope you can hear me. I have to connect with my
Yes, we hear you.
So it is clear.
Yes, Anna. Please continue.
So I need to find my
A little bit louder, Anna, if it's possible, a little bit louder.
Excuse me?
If it's possible, a little bit louder, your voice.
Okay. I'm sorry for this. It's bad luck. Is it better now? Is my voice better now or not?
Yes, it is, Anna. Yes, it's okay. It's okay.
Okay,
I can hear you.
okay. I need to open my PowerPoint. So I was in my slide number 7, I think.
Number 6, in fact.
Yes, okay. I move on to slide 7. Proclus in Plato's Steiris and the tradition of the Chaldeans and Egyptians investigates into the intelligible causes of heavenly movements. And in his commentary on Plato's Republic, he asserts that the seemingly irregular movements of the planets ought not to be explained by means of Ptolemy's complicated theory of eccentric spheres and cycles, but are rather due to the fact that the planets are moved by souls, which express in the movements of their bodies the invisible powers of the forms. Proclus appreciates Ptolemy's astronomy as long as it is seen only as a mathematical mechanical construction, making it possible to calculate and predict the positions of planets, and as long as it does not claim to have any real explanatory value. In Timaeus' commentary, book 3, Proclus attempts a semantic conjunction between time, chronos, horos, and explaining the stability intellectual in one part, and at the same time mobility dancing qualities of time in another. I owe reference to Professor Basley earlier this morning, and thank you for this. Those of us who dance, we understand these two aspects as realities of dance experience. Indeed, analogical relationship between dance and the cosmic order in the movements of the celestial bodies is a repetitive pattern for many different writers. We consider this element as an indication of a conjunction of science with poetry. And several references you can find in the handout to the dramatic poets, to all 3 dramatic poets, Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus, but also to Michael Psellos, who grounded on Proclus' commentaries, refers to the cosmic chorus as a metaphor indicating harmony in political life. Julian's poetic appeals to the king's son, as you can see on the slide, have a similar connotation. Moving to the next slide, let's speak about the tragic choruses. on the one hand, that combine ecstatic and free expressivity with the logic and harmony of the geometric expansion of dance in space. Tragic choruses following strict patterns of movement at their entrance, exit and development in the orchestra had a constant presence on stage throughout the performance, forming squares and circles, and the correlation of the circular structure of the chorus, strophe, antistrophe, epodos, with the winding of the celestial bodies has been pointed out, as in the anonymous scholiast of Euripides Hekuba, and according to the expert on ancient Greek dance, Lilian Lawler. There are still many metaphors, many other metaphors that compare nature, let's say plants or fertile soul, with human nature and more abstract concepts in other Platonic dialogues, in Gorgias, in the Republic. But the most dramatic metaphor that connects to dance is to be found in the Laws, where Plato discusses the proper forms of oral education, but also elaborate an image of human beings as divine puppets or puppets of the gods. An image that appears explicitly twice in the Laws and is strikingly vivid and also involving, according to Professor Leslie Kirk, the complex of individual, community, and cosmos in Plato's modeling of chorea. Following Plato, Plotinus believes that the physical world is a living organism with both and soul, whose members work together in harmony. Another important aspect of the dancing metaphor is to be connected with the problem of beauty and the aesthetic phenomenon in general. About Platonic aesthetics, there is essential writings by Professor Alexandrakis and mention her works, but also about Plotinus as well. But this, I only have to say that the search for the causes of the aesthetic phenomenon in external aesthetic experience is a requirement of its traditional philosophical investigation. Starting with Plotinus, the field of aesthetic experience is defined between the visible and the imaginary world, a distinction between nature and forms of the second hypostasis, while all things are classified into a continuum of higher and lower realities. In fact, Plotinus, according to Monroe Beardsley, Platonic dualism of being and becoming. In the light, in late antiquity, the model of cosmic harmony in the perception of dance still applies, but adorned with more dynamic elements, as in the Plotinus Aeneads, where we have the reference to the variety of dance movements, but also to the organic whole consisting of the moving members of it separately, which reflects the dancing cosmos. In this turn to the individual dancer, orchisis, orchistis, one can see, in addition to the evolution of the art of dance from the tragic to the pantomimic dance, the evolution in the of medicine and biological knowledge of the human body in late antiquity. Plotinus expresses a much more absolutely mystical approach than Plato, arguing that behind the visible world there is a multiple reality, ultimate reality, and the first being beyond any form of knowledge or perception, the good or the infinite. As Richard Jones remarks, while according to Plotinus all things are classified into a continuous higher and lower reality, the opposition between the visible and the imaginary world is maintained as a distinction between the nature and forms of the second hypostasis. And finally, in my last slide, I want to refer to today, to our contemporary experience. We can see that the metaphor of the dance stars remains uninterrupted through the ages, as we can find in the writings of natural philosophers like Marcelo Gleiser, or in the theory of poetry, of literature, as in the text of White about the poetry of Yeats. The philosophy of dance from the time of the Pythagoreans until today refers to the movements in the universe, mainly holding the same view of a universe or a moving universe. But today we face a new reality. I think this new reality of the three-dimensional modeling of the universe that we are now able to reproduce is due this ability we have today to develop a three-dimensional modeling of reality is due to ancient efforts, to Platonic efforts, or to models of the universe like the Antikythera mechanism, but also the efforts of late Antique and even Byzantine scholars by reference to also to the mimesis theory of performance under a cognitive epistemological outlook. I stop.
Thank you, Anna. We have time for just a very short or quick question.
I'm very sorry for this, but also I try to summarize a lot.
Yes, thank you. Please, Anne.
Okay, so thank you very much. That was very interesting, and particularly interesting to me because I've been looking recently at the way in which both Plotinus and Proclus use the metaphor of dancing. The Plotinus that I've been looking at, not only the passage that you mentioned, but the passages where he specifically has choral dancing in mind, it seems to me that, of course, he's thinking about the Timaeus, but I think that the allusions to dancing in the myth of the Phaedrus are also rather important for him. This is the account of the souls processing above the heavens, where they're several times described as being engaged in a theos choros, a divine dance, or something of that kind. And I wondered what you thought about that. Do you think that's an appropriate connection to be making?
Yes, there is a connection, and in a more extended article, I plan to include also Phaedrus and mainly Phaedrus, but I find in the Phaedrus metaphor more a psychological rather than a cosmological
Yeah, indeed.
content. That's why I didn't mention in my paper today. But of course, it's very important because all metaphors in Plato have actually go beyond the cosmological area. So if we want to see in Plotinus and Proclus and later authors, let's say more psychological, more introvert, or even a political human society application of the metaphor, I think we need to take under account the Phaedrus also and other, of course, Republic metaphors, like the metaphor of the grammata in the Republic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we're very much thinking along the same lines. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anna, once again. And now we move to Thomas Essel from the University of Vienna, and the title of his paper is How to Take It Literally: Simplicity Lecture of Aristotelian Issues as Neoplatonic Interpretations of the Timaeus. Thomas.
Yeah, thank you so much. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, of course, very well.
Great. So thank you for having me here and for being able to present my paper. This is a very early stage paper, so I'm happy about all critical comments and suggestions. I read just out a shorter version of the paper. You can find the full version in the Dropbox and the handout as well. Can you please share the handout? This would be helpful, maybe.
Okay, I will do it. Okay.
Or can I do it?
Yes, of course. You can do it. You can do it by yourself. You have access.
Oh, I cannot find it.
All you need to do is look at the bottom of your page, mute,
Yeah.
stop video, share. If you click the share button, whatever is on your screen, we will be able to see.
Okay. Okay, so I can share
Yeah. It's
my
okay now.
whole paper. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So, I just thought, one of the most dominant but equally debatable doctrines in the Platonic corpus is the conceptual pair of being, enai, intelligible entities which constantly and unchangeably are, and becoming, gignestai, sensible entities which underlie constant change through time. A locus classicus for this strict version of this distinction between being and becoming is found at the outset of Plato's main dialogue on natural philosophy, Timaeus. And here he introduces this distinction in a very famous passage, so I don't want to read it out because all of you know it very well for sure.
Seems to have liked.
In the course of the dialogue, Timaeus famously asks whether the cosmos as a whole belongs to the realm of being or to the one of becoming, and Timaeus himself answers this question by assigning it to the realm of becoming. And this is how the Platonic distinction is commonly conceived. And as you know, and as you see in this passage, the answer is that the cosmos is something that has become, so gegonen in the text. This passage gave rise to one of the most extensive controversies among Platonists. This concerns the question whether we should take the statement on the generation of the cosmos literally, meaning that the cosmos had a beginning in time, or metaphorically, meaning that the creation myth of the Timaeus should not be taken literally, since Plato used it only as a didactical device. This question took center stage from the old academy in ancient times onwards. And as far as we know from Aristotle's testimony, Plato's direct adherents took the passage metaphorically and explained its meaning with a pedagogical purpose, while Aristotle famously read Plato literally. By the time of Neoplatonism, an alternative explanation became predominant. Plato calls the world gereton, since he intended to establish the claim that the world, being eternal, depends on a higher cause. According to the Neoplatonic exegesis, the cosmos cannot exist as a simultaneous whole, holon hama. Simultaneous wholes are eternal, have no parts, and their activities are completely present, while the cosmos has its existence extended in time. And this interpretation famously goes back to Proclus. However, the meaning of the cosmos coming into being is highly controversial, and scholars from ancient and present times alike have debated this question without coming to any final agreement. In a seminal paper from 1988, Michael Frede reads the passage in a slightly unorthodox way. He proposes that Plato's distinction between being and becoming does not only concern the question whether the cosmos has a temporal beginning or not, but rather intends to introduce his theory of forms or ideas in the first place. I don't want to read this quotation from Frede, but what he's pointing to is a passage later in the Timaeus where he speaks that we cannot talk about entities which are phenomenon as a this or a that. And so he points to the passage I quote a bit later, and I read this passage now. And here Plato says, what we invariably observe becoming different at different times, fire, for example, to characterize that, i.e. fire, not as this, but each time as what is such, and speak of water not as this, but always as what is such, and never to speak of anything else as this, as though it has some stability of all the things at which we point and use the expressions that and this, and so think we are designating something. For it gets away without abiding the charge of that and this, or any other expression that indicts them of being stable. And according to this passage, Frege explains that becoming for Plato means something like to temporarily take on or display or be made to display the outward character or marks of an F, to come to give or to give the appearance of an F. In this way, the contrast between what is a real F and what just takes on or displays the superficial marks of an F without being one. This is a quote from Frege. And in the end, Frege concludes that if we agree with this interpretation of the distinction between being and becoming, we gain a radical formulation of the theory of forms. According to Frege, it does not amount to rather modestly claiming that the sensible objects underlie all different kinds of change, but rather radically claiming that the objects of experience lack a nature at all, so as to be anything, properly speaking, that they just have to look or appearance of being something, in contrast with those things which really are something because they have a nature. This is original text from Frege as well. I don't want to go into a deeper discussion of Frege's interpretation, but I rather shall point to a striking parallel between the way in which Frege puts this Platonic distinction and one central aim of Aristotle's physics, as I take it, i.e. to show that every process, kinesis, is dependent on a subject, and this very process and the subject in which the process takes in. So the process is causally dependent on the latter, the subject. In other words, for Aristotle, no process can exist independently from a subject, and the subject is epistemologically and ontologically prior to the process in which it is in. And my claim here is that Aristotle, in his theory that all processes depend on subjects, is deeply indebted to Frege's version of the distinction between being and becoming. Namely, that being and becoming are categorically and also ontologically distinct. And so the scope of being and becoming of this distinction is not to make differences in different grades, but rather in different kinds of entities. I take my interpretation for this reading from Simplicius's commentary in Aristotle's Physics, because he exactly reads the Platonic distinction in Aristotle's discussion on change. So I will now look a bit more closer to Aristotle's concept of processes, what we find in Physics 3:4-8, because here Aristotle famously discusses the existence of the infinite. While he accepts that there is infinity in the case of time in extension, that means that time has no beginning or end, and in the case of the divisibility of magnitudes, that means that every magnitude can be divided at every single point further and further, he rejects the possibility of the existence of an infinite substance, ousia, or something what is separated, aphorismenon, in the sensible realm. The discussion is very complex in detail, and I have to skip many problems here, but what matters in our context is how Aristotle explains the sense in which he wants the infinite to exist. In the Physics, he says, but since being is in many ways, just as the day or the contest is, by the constant occurring of other and other, in this way too the infinite is. For in these cases also there is potentially and actually. The Olympic Games are, both in virtue of the contests being able to occur in virtue of the contests occurring. In general, the infinite is in virtue of one's constantly being taken after another. Each thing taken is finite, but it is always one followed by another. Aristotle's argument here might be this, that for a day or the Olympic Games to be actual means for it is to be going on. A particular day or the Olympic Games is not there all at once. For its actual existence, every step taken in its occurrence, that means that one contest within the Olympic Games is always one followed by another. Thus, infinity is never fully actualized, but only partly. One parts occurring is followed by another parts occurring, and so on. Aristotle goes on to argue by comparing the infinite's existence with the existence of a substance. And here the text says, further, being is said in several ways, so that one should not take the infinite as a this, such as a man or a house, but should take it in the sense in which we speak of a day or a contest, which have their being not in the sense that some substance has come to be, but having being always in coming to be and passing away, finite, but always different and different. And here we find Aristotle's most explicit distinction between substances, so this, todity, and processes, kineses. The context makes clear that Aristotle is speaking about particular things in each case. A man or a house simply is, what means that it became gegonen, the way it is now, while a day or a contest is always in the process of generation, in genese, never having any other state than being part by part in a never-ending process. But what can Aristotle mean by being actual one after another, since he also holds that actuality is prior to potentiality, and anything potential must be understood in terms of a corresponding actuality. And so how then a process can be, after all, as it is never fully actual? I take the answer from Simplicius commenting on these passages. Simplicius, in his own words, has the technical repertoire for an explanation found in the Neoplatonic doctrine of the cosmos being. And here we have his comments on the passage. For since, and Simplicius says, for since the potential is spoken of in relation to the actual, the potential will be spoken of in as many ways as is the actual. There are two ways of being actuality, for it is either what exists as a whole as what it is, like a man or a house, or as what has its being in becoming, like a contest and a day. For we say that these also exist in actuality when they exist. So therefore, there are two ways of being potential, the one in relation to what exists whole, all at once, as we say that the bronze is potentially a statue because it sometimes emerges into being a statue, which exists whole, complete, the other in relation to what has its being in becoming. In Simplicius' reading of Aristotle, the Neoplatonic distinction between being a simultaneous whole, to holon hama, and having its being in becoming, and to ginestai to enai echon, plays a prominent role. What is infinite, Simplicius rephrases as having its being in becoming, for example, a contest or a day. The substance, here rephrased as a simultaneous whole, is, for example, a man or a house. By appealing to the Proclean distinction, Simplicius frees it from its original context of explaining the generation of the cosmos as a whole and transfers it to purely physical objects. Being actual and being potential in the physical world may refer to two kinds of entities, to Aristotelian substances and to what is infinite in nature. Thus, Simplicius transposes the Platonic distinction between being for intelligible entities and becoming for sensible entities into the physical world. What is new in the Simplician rephrasing of the distinction is that in his understanding, the world as a whole is not only one side of the dichotomy, but rather the things in the physical world can be classified according to this distinction, and thus being fair to Aristotle's sharp distinction between substances and processes. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Thomas. Are there questions or remarks for Thomas? Okay, David, please.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I think it was very, very interesting. I was not sure in which sense this could give a clue on whether we had to read the Timaeus account literally or as a pedagogical purpose. I mean, there's a sense in which I guess you could draw both conclusions from this. Maybe because, in a sense, the distinction between being and becoming is not, as Frede pointed out, is not as essential for there being literal distinction between pre-cosmos and cosmos. Can you say more about that? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question, because this is really interesting, and I just thought about this point before my talk, because as it seems to me, and please feel free to correct me in this point, but as it seems to me that the traditional Neoplatonic reading of the cosmos in the state of becoming would rather conceives it as in the state of gignomenon. And this is actually not really fair with the text, because in the famous passage when Timaeus wants to say that the cosmos has become, the word is gegonen and not gignomenon, what maybe also could be there. It is gegonen. And the interesting point for me now, when I compared the passages in relation to Aristotle's physics, when he discusses the infinite, it is exactly this word what he uses for designating substances. So when you have a look at, sorry, this is text 2b. Exactly, yeah. It is discussed if this actually is in the original text of Aristotle's physics, but when he speaks here, and we suppose that this is that Aristotle is speaking here, but when he designates the substance here, he says ousia tis gegonen, and not in distinction with processes which are gignomenon. And I think that's just an interesting parallel. That means that when Aristotle reads Plato very literal, and this is why the reason for the title of my talk, because the question arises how we should understand it literally, because there seems to be different understandings of Gegenstein in general, maybe, yeah. And however, he designates the ousia gegonen, and then for an Aristotelian understanding, it should be clear that the cosmos as a whole then should be understood as a substance, and the substance is complete, and nothing, and this is why the distinction for Aristotle is important. It is not in the making, it's not in the process of gignomenon. And this is an interesting result for the moment, I would say.
Thank you.
So sorry, and when I can add this sentence, maybe then when we say that, yeah, we all know that Aristotle is taking Plato literally, meaning that the world has a beginning, this is maybe not totally correct. We should rather say, yeah, it has some process of generation behind it, but it is the cosmos, when Aristotle would read Plato literal in his own sense, the cosmos has the process behind it, but it is complete in the actual state right now.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. Once
Thank
again.
you very much.
And